Hello, Ram55 here, and thanks for tuning in. Now, until recently, I have not posted very many videos. It's been a long time, several years actually, but I've still been playing games, and one of my favorite is Kerbal Space Program. And tonight I want to post a video of what I've been doing recently in my own private Kerbal Space world. I've got some stations out around the Earth and around the Moon, or I should say around Kerbin and around the Moon. And this video is a resupply mission to the Neil Armstrong Lunar Space Station. The crew that's out there right now has been there for about 6 months in Kerbal space time. It's about time we bring them home. So this mission will be bringing a new crew of astronauts or kerbanaughts out to the space station there around the Moon and resupply them with snacks and other goodies for another 6 months. So let's sit back and enjoy as we watch the resupply mission to the Neil Armstrong Space Station around the Moon. So we just jettisoned the first stage, the boosters. And now we're looking to get into an orbit of around 100,000 meters around Kerbin. I've got MechJet loaded, and that box to the upper left will tell me all the orbital data that I need. I'm looking at the apoapsis and the periapsis to get to an altitude of 100,000 meters and then to circularize that orbit once we get there. So now we are peaking at about 100,000 meters. I'll set up a maneuver node at that altitude, at that peak, and this will set up a node so we'll know when to burn to get that orbit into a circular orbit around Kerbin. So do you guys play KSP? Like I said, it's one of my favorite games. I've played it since it was in beta version, I don't know, 8 years ago, whatever it was, and I absolutely love it. Mostly it's the challenge of, okay, this is what I want to do, and can I build a rocket to get there? So I was going up through the atmosphere, and I kept the rocket pointed where our trajectory was going. Once we get out into space, which is at 70,000 meters, I then align it with the maneuver node, which is that blue crosshair. So now we're just simply circularizing our orbit around Kerbin. And those second boosters are empty. We just jettisoned them. We were not in orbit yet, so they'll fall safely back to the planet. Now we'll just fine-tune with moderated thrust to get to that circular orbit. And things happen pretty quickly. I just happen to be in a good spot to line up with a spot to inject ourselves toward the Moon. And basically what you want to do is fire your rockets just before moonrise. If you do that, you'll have one of the more efficient trajectories to get out to the Moon, establish an encounter, and then set up an orbit. So I'm adding another maneuver node. You can see the Moon is over there on the right-hand side. And as we plan our burn, you'll see the orbit is increasing on the far side of Kerbin until we eventually get a counter with the Moon right there. Now we want our apoapsis at the Moon to be approximately the same altitude as the Neil Armstrong Space Station that's already circulating there, and that's at 200,000 meters. So I'll adjust the burn time and the node location to give us the optimum trajectory to get out to that spot. You want to do it at the right spot so you can save as much fuel as possible. Also, less time as well. So once I get a fairly good encounter, I move the maneuver node around to see if it increases or decreases our apoapsis or periapsis at the moon. Once it's at its minimum spot, I think that's probably about the optimum place to be, and then I adjust the time of the burn so that we get that periapsis down to 200,000 meters around the moon. Okay, we've lined ourselves up with the maneuver node. We're just counting down here for the lunar orbit trajectory burn. The saying in space work is that once you get into orbit, you can get anywhere. The hardest part is just getting off the surface of the planet and getting out into orbit. So right now is an exciting time to be interested in space travel with all that's been happening recently. I think it's kind of rekindled everybody's interest and spirit in that final frontier. Here I am just adjusting the burn to get the intercept with the moon. And we are on our way. Here we are, well outside of the orbit, heading toward the moon. But lately, SpaceX has been successfully flying their Falcon 9 rocket, which is amazing, having it come back and land on barges out in the ocean as well as concrete pads on land, bringing Crew Dragon out to the International Space Station, delivering astronauts, and they're in the process right now of delivering their super heavy lifter, which will plan on carrying the Starship, one of Elon Musk's latest development plans. And his idea is to use that to colonize Mars. It is going to be more powerful than the Saturn V that was used to bring the Apollo astronauts to the moon. It's going to be an amazing thing, and that's supposed to launch and try to get into orbit for the first time later this month. And then we've got the Relativity that had the successful launch of their first 3D printed rocket, which is amazing when you think about it. A 3D printed rocket, are you kidding me? That successfully launched, even though the second stage wasn't successful, so they could not get into orbit. Then there's also the Dream Chaser, that's patterned after the space shuttle. So that is going to be riding on top of the ULA Vulcan rocket, but there's been some teething problems getting that to launch and work properly. So that's delayed until later this year, if it is even going to be on time for that. And then Sierra Space is another interesting company, and they've developed what's called a life habitat, which is an inflatable living quarters designed to be used out in space. Pretty remarkable stuff. And then Boeing and NASA have been working on the, I think it's called the Aurora spacecraft and the Space Launch System. But again, they've had lots of delays from Boeing and from NASA in getting those things developed. But fascinating times for those of you who are interested in space travel. So here we are out at the moon, and I wish I could take credit for that, but you can see in the distance there the Neil Armstrong space station orbiting the moon. I wish I could say I planned it to be this close, but it was just pure luck, pure chance. But I'll take it. That'll make rendezvousing really, really easy. So once we establish ourselves in an orbit around the moon, you can see that the space station is slightly out in front of us. And when you're behind something that you're trying to rendezvous with, you want to be in a lower orbit, because a lower orbit will go faster than a higher orbit. And that's the way it works in real life. When they rendezvous with the International Space Station, they'll be either usually slightly below it and then catch up to it very slowly. And after a couple fine-tuning burns here, I'll get my orbit circularized so that we're about 2 kilometers, 2 to 4 kilometers below the space station's orbit. So we will slowly catch up to it. And by having it just a couple kilometers below the space station's orbit, when we get as close as possible, we'll only be 2 kilometers away, which is about a mile. And it'll make rendezvousing and docking very easy. So just fine-tuning those maneuvers. Once we get close, basically you set the space station as your target. Right here I'm just adjusting my inclination here so that this spaceship's orbit is in the same plane as the space station. You don't want to be all winked out where you're only coming across them for a brief period of time and cutting across at an angle. So you want to be in the same plane. So that's what this brief burn is doing. But anyways, once you set the space station as a target and you get very close to them, what you want to do is point your spaceship at the target and then just start closing on it. Again, just dumb luck that we came to be so close. So I've opened up the docking hatch. I'm going to control it from there. And I'm also opening up the docking port coordinator there. Basically, it's a crosshair kind of deal, and you'll see how that works in a little bit, those of you who haven't played Kerbal Space Program. So now, the whole game is to just point toward the target, which is, in this case, the space station, and accelerate towards it. And I want to do that at about 40 meters per second or so. That'll give me a nice closure rate, nice and controlled, so I won't go crashing into it. And this whole mission has gone so smoothly. It's unbelievable. I've never had a rendezvous so close when I got into orbit around the moon. And you can see that right now on the little ball at the bottom that the flight path marker is staying just locked right on the target. And usually that's not the case. Usually it drifts away a little bit and you have to do a little bit of maneuvering of your spaceship to get that coordinated. So anyways, we just had came within range, and you can see that the docking crosshairs have come to light there, and I've decided which docking port I want to target. So basically what I'm going to do is maneuver so that that orange, well, first of all, we want to bring our closure rate down to about 0 when we get within a reasonable distance. And so that'll be the next thing on the agenda here is we turn away from the target. We're closing at a reasonable speed, but we want to get that down close to 0. Once the closure rate's down to a few meters per second, we'll switch over to controlling using the RCS system, or the reaction control system. It's much better for fine tuning as you're moving through space. That motor on the back gives you a lot of thrust, but it's not great for parking. So now basically what I'm going to do is turn the spaceship around, and you can see that orange marker, and that'll tell me how I'm lined up with the docking port. What I want to do is bring that orange marker right dead center in those crosshairs. Just fine tune it a little bit back and forth. Once that orange marker is dead center in those crosshairs, my spaceship is lined up with the docking port. That yellow flight path marker is where my spaceship is heading right now relative to where it's pointing. So what you want to do is put your flight path marker on the same side as where those green lines line up. And that means you're moving toward the intersection. And as you're moving toward that intersection of where those green lines are, they will move to the center of the crosshairs, and then everything will be lined up. The green lines will be lined up on those gray lines that are right in the center of that docking mechanism. And that will be lined up with the orange circle, and eventually the yellow flight path marker will be lined up. So everything's lined up, and then you're just a matter of moving in closely or slowly and closer to the docking port to mate. So basically that yellow flight path marker is hollow. If it had an X through it, we would be moving away. So we're actually closing very slowly with the docking port on the space station, and you'll see those green lines moving closer and closer to the center of the crosshairs. So how many of you folks are following the current space stuff going on in the real world right now? What's your favorite part of it? Do you think we'll be on our way to Mars in a couple years? What do you think the chances of the Starship being successfully put into orbit later this month? Leave your comments below. Let me know. So this is a very slow process. In fact, when the space shuttle or the Crew Dragon actually docks with the International Spaceship, they are moving at just a few centimeters per second. Very, very slow. Obviously, you don't want to be damaging this multi-billion-dollar station out in space. So things are under close scrutiny, very slow, methodical control. I'm going actually faster now than they would be in real life. In fact, in real life, they have, I think, 3 or 4 different spots that they have to get to. There's a bubble around the International Space Center, and they got to stop at each of those bubbles, stabilize, to make sure things are under control. Then they are allowed to move in closer and closer. And finally, at 20 meters, I think they do their last check to make sure everything's under control, and they move in for final contact. So I'm actually moving in a lot closer than they would be in real life. Those green lines are getting much closer to being lined up. And in a moment, everything will be right down the middle. And you can see me firing the RCS motors, making those fine-tuning adjustments. And with those, you can translate up, down, left, right, forward, and back. With the rockets on the back of the engine, you can't. You can only go forward. So the RCS motors allow you to fine-tune without having to move your rocket all around. Okay, everything's all lined up now. Now it's a matter of just closing in nice and slow and controlled, and keeping those green lines in the crosshairs. In fact, if you watch Crew Dragon docking at the International Space Station, you can see its own RCS motors firing. And just like in Kerbal Space Center here, they actually put out a little plume, and you can see when they're adjusting their path. So here we are looking at it from behind the space station. Everything's looking good. Now eventually we'll get within a few meters of the docking port, and at that point there's like magnets that kind of pull them together. And I take the RCS system off because it will try to keep you centered, and I don't want that to happen. I want it to just kind of using the magnets to draw themselves into each other. So on the top of the trackball there, you can see our closure rate. Bottom left of the docking port indicator, you can see our distance. And very soon I'll just turn off the RCS. Usually I would have done that by now, but did it a little bit late. But there we are, we're docked. That is success. And the new crew is greeting the old crew, and they're shaking hands and giving themselves hugs. The old crew is relieved to finally be going home. And the new crew is excited to be out around the moon and start doing their experiments. So right now they're going to be getting settled in. They're going to be unpacking the supplies they brought with them, all their snacks and other goodies that the kerbanaughts love to eat, whatever other supplies that they have. And now, after being up in orbit there for a couple Kerbal days about 6 hours, they've done unloading the rocket. The space station's been resupplied, the crew has been transferred, and the old crew is now up in the capsule. And they're going to plan their escape burn to get back to Kerbin. For this one, you want to burn so that you're going in the opposite direction of the moon's orbit. So basically you're slowing down. When you slow down, you tend to fall, and you want to fall back to Kerbin. So that's why you set up that burn to be going the opposite direction of the orbit of the moon. You want to be going slower than the moon, and you will gradually slow down and get captured by Kerbin's gravity. I'm trying to set up a 100,000 meter orbit around Kerbin, and doing the same techniques of sliding that maneuver node around to get the optimum spot so we use as little fuel as possible. Kind of niggly, but you want to get it pretty darn close. You can see that gold line is kind of going away, or to the left. That's going away from the orbit, so it's almost parallel to the orbit of the moon. And that's the optimum time to burn. Now it's just a matter of waiting to the right time to get to that maneuver node to start our burn to return to Kerbin. You can see the Neil Armstrong space station out there in front of the spaceship. And when I first undocked, I went back and down so that we're not in the same plane, because you're going to see that go screaming by, and the last thing you want to do is run into that thing. There it goes off the left side. And we're on our way back to Kerbin. Now that we've got that orbit or that burn done, the next maneuver node is, once we get established at that point around Kerbin, we want to circularize our orbit. So we want to slow down again, and you'll see that the far marker is falling down to the 100,000 meter mark. So that will be in a circular orbit around Kerbin. And from there, we'll set up for a landing. Saying goodbye to the moon. Now the trip from Kerbin to the moon takes about 1 Kerbin day, which is about 6 hours. A little bit over, but not bad. And those aren't clouds in the distance. That's the equivalent of Earth's Milky Way. That's the galaxy that Kerbin sits in. Billions and billions of stars. Kerbin getting bigger in the windshield. And finally, we're approaching that 100,000 meter mark. We'll be getting ready to circularize our orbit. Again, aligning with the maneuver node, that blue triangular looking thing. And because we want to slow down, we're pointing backwards. So we're going to fire our rockets going backwards to slow us down, which then reduces the size of the orbit on the other side of the planet so that it becomes a circle. Right now it looks like a giant egg. And if you look at the numbers up in the MechJeb at the top left, you'll see the periapsis and apoapsis will eventually equal at around 100,000 meters. Those kerbanaughts in the bottom right are really digging it. I'm just fine-tuning to get that into almost a perfect circle. And right about here, I find out that I made a major blunder in designing this spaceship. I originally designed this spaceship a couple years ago, and it was designed to go out in space and shuttle kerbanaughts from the John Glenn Earth Space Station to the Neil Armstrong Moon Space Station, back and forth. It was never designed to return to Kerbin and splash down with parachutes and all that stuff. But this mission was going to be specific to resupply the moon. I didn't want to rely on space planes, so I redesigned this spaceship a little bit. I added some parachutes and whatnot, and I was convinced that I put a separator between the capsule on the top, the pointy end, and the rest of the vehicle, and I forgot. I didn't do it. So this thing's coming down in one big piece, and quite frankly, I'm not sure the parachutes are going to slow it down enough. Is it going to have a problem coming down? Will the thing blow up when it re-enters? I have no idea. Will we lose these kerbanaughts on re-entry? I don't know. Once again, we're aligned with a maneuver node that will slow us from a circular orbit, and basically when I come in from 100,000 meters, I want to get the low point down to about 35,000 meters. So space begins around Kerbin at around 70, and if I set that low point in the orbit down to about 35,000, I kind of can figure out where the spaceship is going to land. So I just tried to separate that big old chunk of spaceship behind the capsule, and nothing happened. And right now I'm thinking, oh man, am I in trouble? And I'm thinking, it's got to be in here somewhere. I'm sure I added a separator. But no matter how hard I look, it's not there. This whole thing is coming down as one piece. I did add a heat shield to the capsule, but I forgot to add a separator between those other stages and the capsule. I'm saying, okay, it's got to be in here somewhere, but it's not. Some engineer and designer is going to get in trouble over that one. So basically we're at about 54,000 meters. The effects of heat as you re-enter happen at about 53,000 meters. So that should be starting here in a second. and then we'll see what happens to the spaceship. Will it start to explode? Will it start to overheat? I don't know. And if it doesn't blow up on re-entry, will this parachutes be able to slow it down enough to safely impact and land in the water? This is the fun thing about Kerbal Space Program, is designing ships, seeing if you can get something done, traveling to other planets, coming back home, landing them safely. As President Kennedy said when he dedicated the United States to landing a man on the moon, by the end of the decade, he says, space travel is hard. We do it because it's hard, not because it's easy. It is hard. And in the real world, so many of the experts that are building real rockets are finding that out. Now in the distance there you can see the mountains on the horizon. Just beyond those mountains is where the Kerbal Space Center is. And my goal is to land as close as possible to that space center. The other day I had a mission come back, and literally it probably landed within half a mile of the shore. It was my best landing to date. I should say my most accurate landing. So right now I'm just looking at this spaceship and waiting for those warning indicators showing that it's overheating and have things start to blow up. Wondering, are these guys going to survive? Guys and gals, I should say. The pilot is a female. There's our first flag, our first warning that things are starting to overheat. Now, it's not unusual in some of the spaceships I've designed in the past to have bits and pieces blow up and fall off. We'll just see how well this one endures. You can see off to the right of the spaceship, right on the coastline there, that lighter green area, that's the Kerbal Space Center. This was unexpected, having it tumble like that. I was hoping the heavy end would come down first. Now it's coming down pointy end first, which makes me worried again, because that's going to be the part that's going to get the hottest. And obviously that's where our kerbanaughts are. Once the speed gets down to about 1,200 meters per second, you know, you're through the danger point. They're still pretty hot, and they're actually much lower than normally would be for this kind of a re-entry. Ordinarily they start to cool off as high up as about 30,000 meters. Right now they're at 19 or 20,000 meters, and they're still going pretty fast, still pretty hot. But no more flags, so that's a good sign. Things are not overheating. And you can hear from the change in the tone that we're starting to slow down enough. So the spaceship has survived re-entry. Now the question is, will the parachutes be enough to slow it down for a safe landing in the ocean? It's transonic right now. Those white plumes coming off the vehicle tells us that we're still supersonic. Over on the far left corner on the bottom is where the staging indicators are, and you can see the parachutes are in red and they just went gray. So we are now safe to deploy the parachutes. If we deployed them earlier, they would rip right off. We're just going too fast. And we're all the way down to 4,500 meters. Still going fast, still pointing down. I figured it would try to turn around, but it did not. So it's time to deploy those drogue chutes, see if that'll spin us around. And that didn't work either. And at 1,000 meters, they're designed to fully open. And there it goes. How's that for whiplash, eh? That may have broken the necks, or at least twisted the necks of some of those kerbanaughts, but we're slowed down. Ordinarily, a space capsule with 3 parachutes like this would come down at about 4 to 5 meters per second. We're at 10. I think that's a survivable landing. I'm going to try to slow that down a little bit with the RCS rockets, but that doesn't seem to have much of an effect. I could have actually used the rockets, the big rockets on the bottom. We still have some fuel left. Not much, but probably enough to cushion the landing. I was going to try to do it with the RCS system, and that just didn't work. You can see the shadow of the vehicle as it's approaching the ocean there. So those RCS rockets, they work great out in space, but they ain't doing a thing here in the atmosphere. Like I said, if I'd used the rockets on the bottom, it probably would have worked. But as it impacted the ocean, everything below the capsule was destroyed except for those RCS fuel tanks that are floating right next to the spacecraft. But they survived. They're down. They're back. Big relief. Anyways, that's it for tonight's video. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching. Leave a like. Give me a thumbs up. Subscribe if you would like. And we will see you soon. Thanks again for watching.